If I asked you to describe a typical autistic person, where would you start? What would be the first few words that came to mind? Presumably, you wouldn't say anything about physical appearance, because I think everyone knows that's a dead end by now. But what would you say first? I'll let you think on that for a minute, whilst I tell you why I'm asking you in the first place. A few years ago, I made a video called "I'm Quinn and I'm not autistic." In fact, it was where I started introducing my videos with the line, "I'm Quinn and I'm autistic." Because in the early days of this channel, I frequently fielded comments telling me I couldn't be autistic. The commenter always knew someone with an autism diagnosis who was so unlike me, we couldn't possibly be on the same spectrum.
I've had enough of people like you. You're a faker because you're nothing like the autistic person I know. You should be ashamed of yourself.
It's probably an indication of the times that I don't get as many of those these days. I do still get them, but nowhere near as many as I used to, despite the channel being substantially bigger now. It may also help to explain why recent efforts to link autism to maternal use of common painkillers have fallen almost completely flat internationally. Whatever we see reported in the media or hear from politicians, people are gradually coming to terms with not only the existence of autism, but of what it actually is. 7 years ago, when I started Autistic, it was far less likely that a casual YouTube viewer would know any openly autistic people, but times have changed. Now, thanks to increasing awareness and people being more open about neurodivergence, almost everyone has one or two openly neurodivergent friends, colleagues or relatives. But whilst those "you can't be autistic" comments are drying up, they've been replaced with an observation, I suppose we'll call it. These days, a lot of people don't act nasty and tell me I can't be autistic. They're a bit kinder about it. But what they say amounts to much the same thing. They tell me I'm not a typical person with autism.
Thank you kindly for your fine video, sir, and I appreciate you sharing your perspective, but spare a thought for the autistic folks who aren't as lucky as you. You seem to me to be one of those super high-functioning types to my eyes. I find it difficult to believe a typical person who is unfortunately burdened with the unwanted difficulty of an autism diagnosis would comport themselves such as you do, sir.
Now do you see why I'm asking you what you think a typical autist is? How far away am I from whatever that turns out to be? So, whilst you keep thinking about what you think makes a typical autist, I'll take a sip of my tea and roll the titles. The first time someone in a YouTube comment suggested that I was an atypical autist, they capitalised the word. My literal side jumped to the obvious conclusion they must be referring to the TV show of the same name. Were they suggesting I was aping the autistic lead character of the show? Or maybe that I was trying to poach off its success? Nope, it was none of those. By an atypical autist, they just meant not typical. It was their opinion that I'm noticeably different to most other autistic people. Being told something like that brings up odd feelings for someone as comfortable in their autistic skin as I am. I was formally ID'd as autistic back in the 1980s, so I've had over 40 years to get acquainted with what it means and how it contributes to my path through life. But in those same 40-odd years, I've seen huge shifts in public awareness and perception of autism, watched breakthrough theories celebrated to the nines one day, then disclaimed as poppycock the next, and lived through far too many media panics and political scare stories about autism rates, autism causes, autism crises, epidemics, lack of funding, and God knows what else along the way. I've also seen a lot of very different ideas about what a typical autist might be. In 1984, when an enthusiastic and well-read young educational psychologist identified Lorna Wing's pioneering work on autism as being the solution for why I was having trouble at school, the world had a very different picture of what an autistic person might look like. Her first paper in this direction was published in around 1981, And I was one of the first of thousands of provisional diagnoses that would lead to the autism spectrum being adopted worldwide in the early 90s. My friend Jen often jokes about being born on the cusp of Gen X and millennials and having a foot in both camps, and I kind of feel like that's where I am with my autism diagnosis. I spent most of a decade in autism limbo, bearing a spectrum diagnosis in a pre-spectrum world that didn't have a clue what it meant or how it might impact on who I am. But both the formal recognition of the spectrum and the World Wide Web started up in the early 90s, and I was all over both of them from the start. So I've had an active foot in the post-spectrum world for half my life too. When I was first diagnosed, a typical autist would have been a very different beast to what we know now, though it may not be quite what some of you expect. If there's one thing I've learned over those 40 years, it's that if you ask the average Joe on the street what autism is, or how they'd know that someone is autistic, the answers you'll get depend on a huge array of factors. If they already know autistic people, then that will obviously be an important touchstone for them. But there's way more influences on their opinions and understanding in play than that. How old they are, where they come from, what news channels and social media they choose, even who they vote for on election day can all have a big influence on what they think a typical autistic person is. My mum and dad were both of the so-called silent generation, born before World War II but lived through it as children. The first time they ever heard of autism properly was when the psychologist brought it up in relation to me. My dad took it very badly and refused to accept it until his last days. It was only in his final couple of years that he fully understood what my nature meant and how it influenced the course of my life. My mum, a quiet and withdrawn, socially awkward academic type, accepted it as a reality but chose to regard it as a matter of opinion. The psychologist called it autism, but she blamed an educational establishment that had neither the expertise nor the talent to recognise and nurture minds that thought outside the box, like hers and mine. The thing is, I couldn't blame them for not recognising the descriptions of autism we read about when they looked at me. I had difficulty with it too. I may have been an advanced reader for my age, but some of those papers are heavy-going reading for anyone, and most of what was in them wasn't encouraging. But we were reading almost exclusively about the pre-spectrum view of autism back then. The idea of a spectrum of autistic traits was relatively new and hotly debated, but the establishment view that included nonsense like refrigerator mothers and lifelong traumatic outcomes was still the mainstream view. I mean, I say mainstream, but there really wasn't such a thing then. Outside of paediatric and psychiatric circles, you weren't likely to have even heard of autism then. 10 years later, in the 90s, we started to hear the phrases Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum on the actual news. That was when we started to get something you could legitimately call mainstream coverage, and the view of autism being talked about then was wildly different to the one I'd been reading about before in the 1980s. When I got my diagnosis, my parents simply couldn't make the connection between the wild behaviours and strange thinking they read about in the medical literature and the son they were raising, so they both chose disbelief in their own ways. That started to change around the turn of the century. The media was picking up on the increasing number of autism and Asperger's diagnoses by then. New autism charities had started popping up and advertising themselves, and more ordinary folks were buying family computers and going online for the first time. There was an explosion in news and information coinciding with the apparent explosion in autism, and the world started to wake up to the autism spectrum. And, of course, both the media and the medical and educational establishments made it easy for folks to digest. They gave the public a good autism and a bad autism to chew on. There was the bad old classic autism that gave children epilepsy, put them in nappies, robbed them of speech and made them cranky and nasty. Or there was an all-new fancy version that could be talked about, and even grown-ups could have it. Asperger's syndrome was the new, publicly acceptable face of autism, the one people felt they could cope with, rather than the scary one. Yep, this really was the breakthrough mainstream moment at last. From that point forward, it wasn't so much of a problem being open about my nature anymore. When I'd said autism to folks in the 80s, I got blank looks and occasional pity. But in the noughties, I could say Asperger's, and most people not only had a good idea of what it meant, but they had a relatively benign view of it. I still kept quiet about it at work though. I didn't mention it on job applications or bring it up in the workplace. Although I could get over most of the less helpful misconceptions about Asperger's and autism in a social situation, I couldn't afford the possibility of it being used against me at work. Then, a few years later, the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis was dropped from the diagnostic guidelines like a stone, and it all got more complicated for the public. All of a sudden, there was no good autism and bad autism. It was all just autism again, like before. Only now, even though most people didn't know it, it was graded 1, 2, 3. I'd fit into grade 1 as someone who appears to lead a relatively conventional life, but needs assistance with a number of everyday tasks and interactions, whilst grade 3 would need significant support and supervision all or most of the time. But there were, and are, grade 3 folks who can hold a proper conversation and take care of themselves, and grade 1 autists who fly off the handle over nothing and shout all day long. So where's the consistency for the general public? Where's their good and bad autism now? But there was something new brewing across the Atlantic, which, whilst it has thankfully remained relatively self-contained on a political and a medical level, has had significant worldwide impacts on public perceptions of what a typical autist might look like. There's this misnomer we hear all the time these days about classic autism or Kanner autism, as distinct from high-functioning people like I'm usually told I am. The history of autism research and the efforts to define what autism is as a distinct diagnosis is a fascinating study if you're ever inclined, but the TLDR is that Leo Kanner, as he chose to be called, maybe wasn't quite the father of autism he's commonly credited as. It's well known that his work that was published in the 1940s was built upon the work of numerous others before him, but not so many realise that it was another 40 years or so before autism would actually be included in the DSM as a distinct diagnosis. Dozens of other researchers and theorists added to his work before autism made it into the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders Edition 3, or DSM-3 as it's better known, in 1980. I guess that makes the DSM-3 a good foundation for whatever classic autism is, shouldn't it? It was the first nationally recognised and certainly internationally influential definition of autism. The terms classic and original are pretty much interchangeable. Now, if you take the time to look up that definition and digest its contents, you'll notice a number of significant differences from our current understanding, not least being that it's much stricter than it is today. I certainly wouldn't have qualified for a diagnosis under that list of traits because I would have had to fulfil all of them, and I just wouldn't have done that. My outbursts weren't spectacular or bizarre enough. My thought processes actually made sense to people some of the time, and the big one, I had no speech delays growing up. Quite the opposite. Under the DSM-3 criteria, it was estimated, but there might be as many as 3 in every 10,000 kids with this rather curious condition. That wasn't a count of how many of us they'd identified so far. It was how many they thought they would eventually find when they properly started looking. Far cry from the, I think it's 1 in 31 getting diagnosed now, according to the CDC. But that's just numbers, not the kind of difference I'm talking about. There's an almost nostalgic view that a certain type of individual takes of this so-called classic autism, Kanner autism, or even full-blown autism, I've heard it called. A halcyon view of a simpler autism that you could just write off with an "oh shucks" and a few bucks to an autism charity. But there's something all those rose-tinted views of a happier autistic time have in common that you won't find in the DSM-3. There's no mention there of intellectual disability. There's lots of talk of impairments and deficits, but they're all to do with communication, speech, social interaction and bizarre behaviours. But nothing about intellectual capacity or reasoning, reduced or otherwise, is mentioned in the DSM-3 as a symptom or a trait of autism. You had to have social behavioural problems, you needed speech delays or to be mute, and you had to have repetitive or restricted interests, but your IQ wouldn't matter one iota. So why is it that now people keep talking about classic autism or Kanner autism as if it's characterised by profound intellectual disabilities? My wife, Alex, knew a lot of autistic people before she met me, which was kind of why I told her about my diagnosis on our very first proper date. We'd been chatting online for a couple of weeks before we actually met in person, and she told me about her work in the past as a care worker with autistic people. I figured she'd work it out anyway, so I just told her, but I was wrong. To this day, she insists that she never met an autistic person like me before we met, and she'd never have twigged back then if I hadn't told her. But that's because her experience of autistic people wasn't of people like me. They were people deemed to have challenging behaviour, and as much of a pain in the arse as I know I can be at times, I rarely fit into that category. And since we got together, I've met loads of other people who work in the care sector with similar challenging behaviour today, and they've all told me similar stories to Alex. They're used to people who make lots of noise, who break things, or who have violent meltdowns. Then there's those that aren't a risk, but they just act really inappropriately. They can't talk about anything outside their special interests. They have unusual attachments, or perhaps they keep falling in love with their carers. They're not used to autists who get married, have jobs, or make YouTube videos. But again, very few tales from any of those about autistic service users with intellectual disabilities, at least not in the UK and Europe. Lots of behavioural, communication and sensory problems, but not much in the way of low IQs. My behaviour has rarely been considered challenging though, at least not since my school days. But after 20 years together, it's a lot easier for Alex to see the autism in me, because she's seen me in situations where it's undeniable. She's watched me shut down and coaxed me back to reality afterwards. She's helped me make sense of people who seem bonkers to me and supported me to cope with many of the aspects of ordinary life I couldn't handle on my own. She's had the opportunity to see the autism she couldn't see before, and it's changed her idea about what makes a typical autist. Every time I make any mention of alexithymia, the way that autistic emotions can just evaporate when we're put under stress and put us into an unemotional robot mode, someone will point out that they're autistic, or they know someone who's autistic, and they never do that. Why are they talking about that as much? Well, because that's not my experience. So I can't talk about that with as much authority. But I do know that at least half of autistic people do have alexithymia, so half of you will relate to what I go through in that respect. I've mentioned before about how I never get the urge to be selfish or always think about it too late, but someone always messages me to say that so-and-so is as autistic as they come and they're totally selfish, nothing like I was suggesting. I also don't get angry. It's almost impossible to get a rise out of me by provoking me or trying to unsettle me. Friends used to joke that cucumbers aspire to be as cool as me. Not in the Fonzie leather jacket sense, but in the never loses my rag sense of cool. But whenever I bring that up on screen, an autist will email me or leave me a comment describing their lifelong struggles with rage. But it's possible to be autistic and be all those things, because autism isn't just a set of diagnostic criteria. It's people, and it's communication. Autism is nothing without people. Go right back to those original DSM3 criteria and look for the common thread that binds it all together. If you're up for it, maybe go a bit further. Look up those papers from the 60s and 70s that I read in my teens. Read Rimland's checklist for autism from the mid-60s, both of them. Take a look at Rutter's 70s work on deviant social communication, or maybe go back to the DSM-1 and 2. Go back to the 40s, where much of what we now call autism was bundled into paediatric schizophrenia. I've watched the public understanding of autism grow from nothing through a period of blatant misinformation into a slightly more optimistic direction that's allowing us to finally do more to actively help autistic people navigate the world better rather than just writing us off or trying to rewrite our brains. It's not a done deal yet, though, because there's still a lot of grey areas in the Autism Handbook still waiting to be finalised. Plenty of scope for ambitious young researchers to make a name for themselves and for opportunistic charlatans to make a quick buck. The very first inklings of what we now call autism didn't go into much detail about how or why our communication was different, only that it was different from the local norm, and the same applied to all the behavioural, social and speech-related quirks they saw in the children they studied. Compared to any of the DSM or ICD definitions, they were incredibly vague. Each time the diagnostic manuals have been revised in the last half-century, the definitions, divisions and classifications for autism and the spectrum have been changed, and there are subtle differences between the US DSM and the rest of the world ICD definitions every time too. Some people find it difficult to accept something like autism, or any neurodivergence for that matter, without a strict set of diagnostic criteria and a determined perspective that it's a bad thing. If it's serious enough to warrant a name and the label of disability in the first place, then it should darn well stay in its lane and know its place. They can't be dealing with an autism that's bad sometimes but not always and can sometimes be an asset. They need it to be 100% the bad thing, or they're not equipped to deal with it. But life isn't as simple as that. Nature not as uninspired, nor fate as predictable. We don't live in a static world, we live in a momentary snapshot of an ever-growing, changing, multiplying, evolving system, not only of life and biology, but of culture, knowledge, thought and human connection. I get tired of the cliched old saying, if you've met one autist, you've met one autist, just as much as the traditionalists who want to go back to good and bad flavours of autism, but not for the same reasons as them. They don't like it because it makes things uncertain for them, unpredictable, and for many of them makes them uncomfortable with their own position in the social hierarchy. Some even resent the idea that us autists may be forgiven some of our foibles thanks to our diagnoses, whilst they'll still be held accountable. But those fears can only come from a guilty conscience, so who are they really upset with, eh? I've simply heard the phrase too much, said it too much myself, and know the truth of it too much too. I've been lucky to have interacted with thousands of different autists in the 42 years since I found out I was one myself. Every one is a distinct and unique individual with their own life story, opinions, feelings and preferences, and not one agrees with everything I say on screen, because that's not what autism is, not now and not ever. Even at its strictest and most narrow of definitions, there has still been infinite scope for variety within its meaning. And when that meaning has a habit of going through paradigm shifts every decade or so, that variety can only diversify. Even in its earliest infancy, when autism was thought to be some form of juvenile psychopathy or schizophrenia, there was so much variation between patients that it wasn't possible to tie down a description of a typical autist then any more than it is now. In my humble opinion, any suggestion that I'm an atypical autist are ridiculous, because there's no such thing as a typical autist. We can do all the same exercises with statistics and demographics to hash out some sort of average to represent a typical autist, but it wouldn't be any more accurate than representing a typical man on the street. Statistically, we can generalise and point to likelihoods and possibilities about any individual. But even the most educated attempt to predict someone's feelings, thoughts or reactions, let alone what they might struggle with in life behind closed doors where we can't see them, will miss lots of important things out. Concepts like typical and average are really useful tools for understanding the world. For an autist with a high sense of veracity like me, they're even more so, but they are just blunt instruments. People often throw them into the mix to shut debate down, when in truth they're actually the start of the conversation. Averages and typicals may set you on the road to discovery, but they aren't the final destination. So, if you're positively identified as autistic, you fit all the criteria, and you find the knowledge and what you learn about yourself because of it useful to lead a better life, then you're a completely typical autist for what it's worth, because there really isn't one. By the same token, if there's something about you, your behaviour, your feelings that's completely unlike every other autist, that makes you completely atypical at the same time. It doesn't matter if you're a meltdowner, a shutdowner, or a wander-off into a cornerer. They're all autistic traits. You could struggle to cope outdoors without noise-cancelling headphones, or spend your life stomping and shouting like Yosemite Sam, and still be autistic. And you could be a non-speaking child with epilepsy, intellectual disabilities and incontinence, or a middle-aged man with a wife, a cat and a YouTube channel. That's why we call it a spectrum. That's all for this week, folks. It's been a difficult week following last week's event, so I've kept things simple again whilst I try to get back to normal. It really threw me for six, that one. I received some lovely emails and messages in the week, but there's one I'd like to quote from now because it relates so closely to what I've talked about today. A great deal of the things that you've discussed resonate with me, even though our journeys are quite different, and I've found much of your content very helpful. Even when you're discussing something that isn't fully relevant to me, or which I don't agree with entirely, the thought that you put into your content means that you're always worth listening to. Thank you so much for that. That really meant a lot. But it's expressing exactly what I'm talking about today. My autistic experience is unlikely to be a carbon copy of anyone else's, but there's always a lot of crossover because we're autistic. Despite some apparently big differences in surface detail, there's an awful lot of similarities under the hood. I'll just quickly remind you that liking, subscribing, and now hyping can and does make a big difference to the channel. And if you can afford to help me pay my rent and bills so I can keep making videos like these, there's links to Patreon, Ko-fi, and of course YouTube thanks down below. If you sign up as a paying patron, you also get a second exclusive video every week too. Now, I'm still interested to hear about your undiagnosed autistic relatives, so please keep those stories coming. You've already shared some lovely and intriguing stories with me, and I'm looking forward to more. It should make for an interesting and, I think, pretty heartwarming video to come. I'll leave it there for today. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching.